I want to thank a number of people: Dave Triple from Neighbors for Peace, Faridad from Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism, and Jolene, also from Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism, for helping us in putting on this presentation on your behalf, and for providing the opportunity to hear another side of not only the Iranian experience, but our experience, because generally our experience is interpreted for us through the mainstream media, which filters reality, not in our interest, but to affect a kind of ideological control. I want to introduce Golbar Bashi. She's a visiting scholar at the Department of Middle East and Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia University, and she's currently in the final stages of writing her PhD dissertation, working on human rights, civil rights, and women's rights. The purpose of her work is to open up the domain and discourses of political discussion of human and women's rights in Iran back to open it up into a lived experience and add the historical nuances that are so often removed when we hear stories of or see pictures of what is mislabeled the Middle East. The Middle East, as I was reminded today, depends on where you happen to be standing on the planet. So it's a sort of colonialism, an expression of colonialism that we in this country label other societies. So with that said, I welcome you and thank you for coming. And this is the mic.
I was speaking about women and the impact of war yesterday at the DePaul University here in town, and I mentioned, and as we all know, women in war-torn countries pay the highest price of battle in terms of losing their lives, limbs, becoming homeless. They become exposed to sexual violence, trafficking, and systematic rape as a war crime. While the less obvious aspects of their losses is the jobs they lose, the setbacks they suffer in their long struggles for bringing democracy and equality to their countries, many women lose and girls lose their support networks, their children, sisters, friends, husbands, neighbors, and often they lose people who may have had the financial sort of responsibility of the households. The psychological and the financial cost of war, of course, is a whole other area. I won't go into it. I'm sure we all know. And also the environmental impact of war. Last night, I argued that women in the states which wage wars and invasions, such as here in the United States, also suffer tremendously. Women in the US military, while humanizing the face of war, pay with their lives, mental health, and limbs. They're systematically discriminated against in the US military, they're underpaid, and many women, especially in the Air Force, have been subjected to rape and sexual harassment. And of course, the nation's tax money, instead of going to healthcare, education, and medical health, goes into making bombs. So we all know that. And most women who enlist in the US military do it not because they think it's fun, but it's the only choice for them to make a living. And they come from very poor backgrounds. A lot of black women and other sort of racially marginalized women join the military. Almost no white middle-class women join the US military. So women on either side of the crossfire, the poor here in the United States and the women in the war-torn areas, are the ultimate losers. In my talk tonight, I will try and give you a picture of who women of Iran are. I will give you a little historical background. I'll tell you a little bit about their aspirations, predicaments, before I go on to explain what a possible attack on their homeland would mean to them. So if I start with the 19th century, I can tell you that women in modern Iran have been visible and active component of their country's multifaceted liberation movements since the 19th century, ranging from being poets, rebels, theologians, to being politicians, political activists of the 1906 constitutional revolution. They've been publishers, teachers, writers, artists, journalists, university professors, public intellectuals, and the list is long. Later in the 20th century, under the Pahlavi monarchy, middle-class women in Iran, in urban Iran, started benefiting from liberal reforms in family law, from free education, healthcare, etc., while working-class women, rural women, and religious women were very much shunned by the imperial court, to whom they were a source of embarrassment. So this group, the majority of Iranian women did not benefit much from the country's wealth during most of the 20th century. But women who were politically active joined the oppositional groups, such as Cherikhay Fadaiye Khalq or the Mujahideen, but these groups were militant and they didn't really have a feminist agenda. So other women who were not ready to join these sort of militant groups, they read works of revolutionary theorists, feminist leaders from across the world, and they formed some sort of an embryonic literary movement, women's movement in Iran, which was part of the oppositional prose movement. We call it Ta'ahud Adabi, commitment in literature. These women, they were writers, journalists, and they were laying the ground in the latter part of the 20th century for a more democratic women's movement than what the Pahlavi imperial court offered. Because a lot of monarchist historiographers tell us that there was this wonderful women's movement during the Pahlavi, and women benefited so much, and things were so much better during that time. It was if you were middle, upper class, urban, and not political. Female members of the revolutionary movement, they helped topple the imperial system in 1979, People's Revolution, which tragically was hijacked and Islamicized by one faction of Iranian society, by all means not the entire society, namely the radical clerics. In short, the phenomenon of Iranian women's movement begins with the historical evidence of large numbers of women struggling for freedom, their participation in the workforce, their formation of voluntary associations, and expression of their ideals and aspirations in literature, art, political activism, and scholarship. Women in Iran have been, they're not obviously a big unanimous group. They're divided among any number of binaries, as we have it here in America. There are Iranian women who live outside Iran, there are women who live inside Iran, there are those who are radical or liberal, middle class as opposed to labor and peasantry, activists, scholars, and of course these categories are not thorough and exclusive. Women in today's Iran constitute 64% of the university graduates. They have achieved excellence in fields of literacy, education, art, journalism, political participation, cinema, and law. Since the 1979 revolution, while the Islamist and clerical class took an uncompromising revenge on the secular middle classes, women from the former backgrounds, as in the religious and the working classes, they entered the public sphere, and this gave them a chance to get into the workforce. And they now demand reform in religious thinking, and they have forced this, and they're very much part of a new progressive religious movement in Iran. During the reformist government of President Khatami, during 1997 and 2005, Iran had elected more women to its parliament than the Americans have to Congress. The picture, of course, isn't just rosy and wonderful. Most active women feminists in Iran are Tehran-based. They're middle class. They're Persian-speaking. Persian is not the majority language in Iran. There are lots of other languages that are spoken, but it is the official language. They're heavily censored and intimidated by the officials of the Islamic Republic, including conservative anti-feminist women. And even if they're not censored, their language and activism is by large predetermined by the ideological tyranny of the Islamic Republic. They constantly face the solid barrier of operating within a gender apartheid state, and therefore their advancements are very limited and often very slow. Nonetheless, this polarized urban middle-class women's movement that we still have in Iran remains revolved around the pursuit of equal rights, equal legal rights, and they have a very active women's literary, press, online and academic presence. And in the past couple of years, Iranian women have staged courageous sit-ins and street protests in large cities, and they have mobilized themselves massively through the internet, demanding changes, and it's been a precedent. And they have managed to form the largest independent women's coalition in Iran since the fall of the Shah. Informal network of women's non-governmental organizations and independent associations have asserted their grievances and demands through civil disobedience. Members of environmental and educational NGOs, staffers at Tehran University and other universities, student publications, they've all joined them too. And web bloggers, male supporters, and even Iran's Nobel Peace Prize winner Shirin Ebadi has given her name to their cause. Never have Iranian women, though, forget about self-serving, pathetic oppositional groups outside Iran or career opportunist characters in US think tanks. Forget about those. But Iranian women themselves inside Iran have never called or asked for foreign involvement in their demands for achieving democracy and equality in Iran, other than appeals to international human rights groups and NGOs. In fact, Iranian women activists have refused to accept US aid, and Shirin Ebadi, the distinguished Iranian recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in the field of defending human rights, has repeatedly announced that while she and her fellow activists continue to oppose and fight Iran's gender apartheid system, they would never support, but in fact would fight a US-led assault on their homeland. So as we see, there's an active, independent, sophisticated and uncompromising women's movement inside this theocracy that the Fox News and the CNN and the Bush administration repeatedly calls the greatest threat to world peace. Women in Iran go about their daily life. They are the cornerstones of Iranian democratic movement, and while they live under hardship, they have hopes in subverting this hardship by their own bare hands. And there are at least no bombs being dropped from the sky, no homes, schools, universities, hospitals, bridges or factories being destroyed, no lives or limbs are being lost, no friends, cousins, mothers, fathers, brothers or husbands are being killed, and no criminal gangs or an occupying army is threatening their security in the streets. Their water, their environment and their food supply isn't polluted by any bombs, God forbid, a chemical or nuclear bomb made in the United States, nor is their cultural heritage looted or their paychecks burned. As in all recent wars in Kosovo, as in Rwanda, we know that when a war is waged, women are not only subjected to the conventional horrors of military action, as in being shot, killed, maimed, and so forth, but they're systematically subjected to rape, starvation, torture, and other horrors by their enemies or even by their own men. Women in Rwanda, for example, were deliberately raped by HIV-positive soldiers in rape camps in order to eradicate the next generation of their people. Women in the former Yugoslavia were also systematically raped and tortured, as were women in the First and Second World Wars in Japan and by other nations. And if we were to look at the current example of women in Iraq, which we hopefully see through alternative media, we see that since 2003, women and girls have not only been equally bombed and traumatized as their male counterparts, but they have been subjected to abductions, rape and murder as a punishment for those of them who dare hold a professional job. I quote from a recent article in the British Guardian. A women's rights campaigner, Salam, a nickname, knows about the 3 men in the Opal. They tried to kill her on 11th of December last year. It was a Sunday, she recalls, and 15 bullets were fired into her car as she drove home from teaching at an internet cafe. A man in civilian clothes got out of the car and opened fire. 3 bullets hit her, 1 lodging close to her spinal cord. Her son was also hit, and she saw the gun, a police-issued Glock. She's convinced that her assassin would be working for the state. And bodies of young women in Iraq are appearing in dusty lanes and avenues, places patrolled by packs of dogs where boundaries bleed into the desert, is a favorite place for dumping murder victims. Iraq's women are living with fear that that is increasing in line with the numbers of people dying violently every month in that country. They die for being a member of a wrong sect and for helping their fellow women. They die for doing jobs that the militants have decreed that they cannot do, for working in hospitals, ministries, universities, all the things that they used to do before. And they speak of the terror of speaking their mind, of going out to work, and all sorts of things. And an Amnesty International report says that women and girls in Iraq live in fear of violence as the conflict intensifies and insecurity spirals. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are reported to have been killed or injured in the military attacks by armed groups since the US-led invasion of in March 2003. The lawlessness and increased killings, abductions and rapes that followed the overthrow of the government of Saddam Hussein has restricted women's movement and their ability to go to school, work, and they're facing discriminatory laws and all sorts of things. So I can say without any hesitation that a similar thing would happen, if not worse, if a war was waged on Iran or a bomb was dropped and the country was invaded. In fact, I think that in Iran things might get even worse. I'll give you an example why. When the tragic earthquake of December 2003 hit the ancient city of Ban, I'm sure you remember, homeless and orphan girls were the subject of rape, trafficking and kidnapping by criminal gangs. The lucky ones who had remaining relatives were bodyguarded day and night and outside these makeshift schools to shield them from being kidnapped and raped. So wars, natural disasters and civil unrest always means chaos. And in chaos, violence, and particularly crimes against women and girls, increases. So in a vast country such as Iran, where like all societies, domestic violence, rape and more increasingly the trafficking of poor women is common, a war would mean a humanitarian catastrophe, not only for individual women and girls, but for women as a collective force in the democratization of the country. Setbacks in all their efforts for political, legal and cultural gains would perish with the first bomb that would be dropped by any foreign country on their homeland. All the energy and attention would be diverted to safeguarding the nation, and in the vast nation, women and girls will be forgotten and trampled upon. Today, when young Iraqi women are abducted and murdered without a ransom demanded, a common daily reality, they have been kidnapped solely to be raped. Even those raped and released are not necessarily safe. The response of some families to finding that a woman has been raped has been to kill her. The very same will be the scenario in many parts of Iran, should war occur. Women rights activists in Iraq state that they have been betrayed by their country's new constitution that guaranteed them a 25% share of membership of the Council of Representatives. That guarantee has turned instead into a fig leaf hiding, which they now call a human rights catastrophe for Iraqi women. This will be the same in Iran should a US-led military regime change occur. The Christian right Bush administration, self-serving native informers, the Iranian Chalabis of this world, oppositional groups, think tank experts do not have the interest of women, especially working class and poor women in mind, but the interest of corporate and capital that provides them with lucrative grants. So what is alarming for any human rights, women's rights or anti-war activists in this country is that in all the recent wars, the new Khan doctrine has been adopted to persuade the public into going to war in the name of democracy and the liberation of Muslim women. This claim is categorically false and indeed criminal. Not only are the intentions of going to war not in order to promote any such a thing as human rights or democracy, however one can achieve this by bombing a nation into it, the consequences of such wars are catastrophic setbacks and direct crimes against women's human rights and for humanity at large. As committed activists, our task is not allowing the women's rights issue or the matter of democracy to get hijacked by warmongers. It is our duty to oppose and expose the cause of women and or the marginalized from being used by statesmen, military men, native informers, posing as feminist human rights activists, scholars for acts of violence. We must ask ourselves if these statesmen, military people, native informers if they really believe in the full emancipation of women in their own countries, we must ask, does Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz really care for black and poor women in New Orleans before they go on to liberate these women? The native informers posing as defenders of the cause of women from their country of birth not only haven't got a blasted clue about women's long efforts for bringing democracy to their countries, but are supporters of the same capitalist anti-women policies which denigrate and put women in hardship in the so-called developed West, depriving women of free education, healthcare and equal opportunities in this country. As the preeminent anti-racist feminist Zila Eisenstein states, the US at present is not what a democracy looks like, neither is feminism. One and the same with the Bush administration's appropriation of women's rights talk on behalf of Afghan women or women in the US military. In a fragile civil society such as Iran, the last thing women or Iranians need in their noble struggle for democracy is an illegitimate and immoral American-led war. Our nightmare now is that Iranian women and girls may not only have to deal with their daily hardships of life under a theocracy, but may indeed have to bear the terrorizing consequences of a US-led invasion. With all the implications for women I just explained in the Iraqi situation, left to their own devices, Iranian women, as elsewhere, will surely pave the way for democratic societies one day. Thank you.
We'll do questions and answers after, and I'd like to, so much of what we believe we know has been constructed for us through the way language has been utilized to shape our perceptions. We've also been quite numbed to the realities we just heard described in Iran and Iraq, so that even the number 650,000 dead Iraqis really doesn't register. If it really registered with us as Americans, I don't see how we could live with ourselves. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hamid Dabashi, who is, I've lost my little thing here, who is at Columbia University. Thanks. He is Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies, a prestigious chair of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature, Columbia University. And he occupies the oldest and most prestigious chair of Iranian Studies in the United States. He has taught and delivered lectures in many North American, European, and Arab and Iranian universities. Professor Dabashi has written 12 books, edited 4, contributed chapters to many more. He's author of over 100 essays, articles, and book reviews in major scholarly and peer-reviewed journals on subjects ranging from Iranian studies, Shiism, medieval and modern Islamic intellectual history, comparative literature, world cinema, trans aesthetics, transnational art, philosophy, mysticism, theology, post-colonial theory, and cultural study. We're really fortunate to have him with us tonight. And one of the things he mentioned last night is the role of public discourse and its significance in creating collective memory driven by discourse amongst the citizens of a society instead of its would-be leaders. So I look forward to hearing what Dr. Dabashi has to say tonight on the subject of the culture of imperialism. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Thanks for coming in this very stormy and rainy and really terrible night. As we were driving to come here and I saw the storm, I didn't think anybody would dare the elements to come. And I thought we would face an empty or maybe a few people to whom I was planning to say on the subject of culture of imperialism that culture is good, imperialism is bad, and go home and be happy. But I'm very, very delighted and grateful that you all took time to come. I'm equally grateful to my host neighbor for peace. As I said yesterday, it is imperative for this generation of anti-war activists to reconnect to the previous generation of the 1960s, that we've all lost them, unfortunately, to the yuppie generation, the generation that became the beneficiary of the Reagan revolution, and all on false promises and horrors of the world that resulted in two figures, the discrepancy between which I proposed to you, as I did last night, the definition of terrorism. The first figure is number 32 with 11 zeros in front of it, which is the military budget of the Bush administration between the year 2000 and 2008. That's one number that I'd like you to keep in mind. The other number is the number 870 million people that go to sleep hungry every night around the world. Until further notice, let's agree that's the definition of terrorism. Under these circumstances, we need to reinvent, rethink, reconnect to what it means to be of anti-war activist. I'm delighted to be here in Chicago with my colleagues and with my comrades who are committed to sustain and retain our civil liberties, which, in my judgment, is the only way that here in the United States, as taxpayers, people who actually pay taxes with which bombs are made and dropped on people, we can perform our civic duties. We have a lot to learn, and there is much to be said. And the first thing that I'd like to start with is the question of as what do we speak? First and foremost, I speak as an American. I am Iranian. I am very proud of my Iranian heritage. But I live here. I live in New York, and it is in New York that I pay, as the rest of you do, triple taxes, a federal tax, and a city tax, and state tax, and so forth. And with these sorts of taxes, I would have liked that public education and public health and job training and training for single mothers would have been supported. But unfortunately, that is not the case, and I contribute, I and everybody else, I presume, in this room, in the warmongering of this administration that we are all hopeful to put an end to. The other thing that I wanted to say in terms of how we need to reinvent ourselves as anti-war activists are very basic terms and very basic assumptions with which we operate. One of them are these terms such as Middle East or remote part of the world. Please remember that Chicago is a remote part of the world. If you live in Egypt, this is not the center of the universe, nor is New York, nor is Washington, D.C. The planet is round, okay? Depends where you are. Well, that is where the remote part of the world is. Middle East, somebody invented that East. Somebody in London was sitting and drawing a map, and to his east was something called the east, and then there was middle and the far and the near. These very assumptions, these very terminologies with which our vocabulary are formed need to be reconsidered. So are names such as Bashi or Dabashi. Please remember that Joe Doe is also a rather odd name if you are not accustomed to it. Or assumptions about the relations between husbands and wives if they don't come from Chicago. I am honored, and I have been honored, for Golbarg Bashi to have been my colleague and comrade long before we became husband and wife. I am blessed for her to be my wife, but prior to that and concurrent with that, we are colleagues and comrades. many assumptions need to be reconsidered and reevaluated and reconsidered and reinvented. And the whole notion is who is among us and who is a foreigner, and how do we disenfranchise people by virtue of their gender or race or national identity or presumed ethnicity. Are all of these factors extremely important to be reconsidered if we are to not repeat our parents' mistakes in terms of identifying with one and disidentifying with another group. The subject of my talk today is the culture of imperialism. And what I mean by that is, first of all, empire, that we live in empire, that somewhere after September the 11th, and with the passage of certain laws such as Homeland Security and Patriot Act, we stopped being citizens of a republic and mutated into subjects of an empire, with our telephones wiretapped, with our emails at the disposal of being checked, with our civil liberties corroded, with the Geneva Convention suspended, with habeas corpus, the cornerstone of American law, thrown out of the window, with illegal arrests, with indeterminate arrest, torture, ladies and gentlemen. It is not just Lindy England of the world who have to be held responsible for what happened in places like Abu Ghraib or in the Bagram Air Base, or like Guantanamo Bay. Our university professors, legal theorists such as Alan Dershowitz. Do you follow? People who theorize the way you go around the world and torture people, and under what particular circumstances, and how do you sterilize the needle before you insert it in order, quote, to cause excruciating pain, but without leaving traces for human rights organizations to go and document it. Those people are to be held accountable. And by virtue of the prominence of Professor Alan Dershowitz, with whom I had the privilege of debating a couple of weeks ago, he's not an ordinary legal theorist. He's a professor of law at Harvard, the most prestigious, the most dignified, the most honorable university that we have in our country. That his argument for legality of torture is not despite the Western European legal theory, but through Western European legal theory. Distinguished human rights activists, such as Michael Ignatieff, endorsing the legality and the reason and conditions under which torture can be perpetrated, not for him not perpetrated, but asserted, is his argument through the European Enlightenment modernity, not despite the European Enlightenment modernity. As a result, my point is, it is not an ad hominem attack on people like Dershowitz, Michael Ignatieff, etc. It is the argument that they provide that they must lead us to go and reconsider things that we have held sacred, such as Western legal theories, or such as European Enlightenment. Agamben, a distinguished Italian philosopher, after 9/11, has written a series of philosophical reflections on what he calls a state of exception after 9/11. And it is important for us to go to read philosophers such as Agamben to see how he argues that, in fact, a state of exception, we are under war, we are under attack, our country is under attack, as a very prominent editor in a daily tabloid in New York put it, having designated one single reporter to chase after me after 9/11 to make sure whatever I say is misreported in her paper. Quote, she said, "Our country is at war, and these bastards are rooting for our enemies, and we have to get them." And it are those assumptions of Judith Millers of this country, people who fabricated, people who deceived the New York Times into believing that, and of course New York Times was a willing partner, into believing that Saddam Hussein was sitting over weapons of mass destruction or had connection to Al-Qaeda, and in turn New York Times deceived an entire nation into accepting that, yes, these are indeed the case. And then when I say that we are implicated, not only by way of our tax money, but by way of our, in fact, silence, okay? Remember that there were also Germans who were silent and said we didn't know during the Holocaust. By way of our silence, these heroic characters, such as my colleagues and comrades here in Chicago, who pass buttons, go in the sub-freezing temperatures, and you have some freezing temperatures in the city, and engage in anti-war activism, these are indices of marks of this particular phase in history that we need to keep in mind. Now, the culture of imperialism. First of all, a word about imperialism. The word that we are living in an empire is not my invention. From as right-wing, pro-imperial historian as Niall Ferguson to a progressive historian like Chalmers Johnson, they have been talking about the mutation of the United States into an imperial apparatus. Whether this is definitive to American culture or accidental to it or whatever, is subject to various theoretical stipulations and things, and is not the subject of our debate. For the sake of the argument, let's simply assume if we live in an age of an empire, that our national interest here in the United States is actually sending, grabbing people by the throat of their poverty and throwing a uniform on their back and sending them halfway around the globe to kill and maim people who are exactly like themselves, but being told that they are their enemies, then we live in an empire. What are our troops doing in Afghanistan or in Iraq? Let's call it the definition of empire. Then, what is the relationship between culture and empire? The relationship between the two, namely norms and mores and imaginative institutions and practices and discourses that either anticipate or corroborate the idea of an empire, has been subject of many learned discussions and theories and counter-theories by a number of people. Perhaps the most famous of these theories in recent history is the 1978 magisterial work of our late colleague and comrade Edward Said, Orientalism. In his book Orientalism, what Edward Said argued, a hint that he gets in fact from theorists before him, Michel Foucault in particular, there is a relationship between power and knowledge. Okay? That then what Edward Said argues, he goes through a series of what he calls Orientalists. Of course, he doesn't invent the term Orientalism. Orientalism, for example, as a school of painting, as a school of in drama, in opera, in literature, existed long before Edward Said. Edward Said didn't invent the word Orientalism, but theorized it. He goes and argues that there is a relationship, that the commencement of European colonialism is in fact coterminous with a manner of knowledge production that is called Orientalism, in part within a scholarship, the field of Oriental studies, one of the most distinguished of which is in fact the University of Chicago, but also in arts, in journalism, in theater, and so forth. Now, pygmies as we are, standing on the shoulder of a giant like Edward Said, now we can see that what he theorized as Orientalism, in fact, may have variations and shades. For example, the Orientalism that you detect in, say, Aeschylus's Persian is slightly different from the Orientalism that you see in Mozart's Abduction from Seraglio, and is slightly different, for example, from the Orientalism that you see in North African colonial postcards of the late 19th and early 20th century. So if, for example, the Orientalism of Aeschylus Persian is Orientalism of fear of Greeks from the Persians, right, and rivalry, the Orientalism of Abduction from Seraglio of Mozart's time is Orientalism of envy of the Ottoman Empire. So these are slightly two variations on the modality of Orientalism. In his way of theorizing these sort of multiplicities of Orientalism, Edward Said lumps them together. Whereas after him, it is imperative for us to separate variations of Orientalism. That is, the mode of Orientalism most particularly definitive to what he was after was the Orientalism that, in fact, was coterminous with the European colonial period and a mode of knowledge that was conducive with that colonial domination. Now, what Edward Said did in Orientalism, he argued it through, because he was not a historian, he was a literary critic, he argued it through the notion of representation. In fact, he wrote it, as he has said it autobiographically, after he witnessed the 1967 war and then the 1973 war, and he said the variations in the perception of how Arabs were perceived in the public domain after the 1973 war led him into a reconsideration of representation, how people are represented. So it is through the category of representation that Edward Said argued the idea of Orientalism. Whereas, if you take the discussion and shift it to the domain of sociology of knowledge, his theoretical observations are in fact very modest observations. A very rich, very diversified, very powerful field of sociology of knowledge that begins with Karl Marx. And in fact, one of the greatest theories of sociology of knowledge was George Herbert Mead right here in this city at the University of Chicago. And then Robert K. Merton and other Max Scheler, other sociologists of knowledge, the relationship between what state a society in, what is the political, social, normative disposition of a society, and what sort of knowledge is produced is a common knowledge. And in fact, for example, a sociologist of knowledge such as Max Scheler says there is no I before me. That is, first in a society we have a conception of me, socially manufactured, before I can even say I. In other words, when a scientist, when a sociologist, a historian begins to make observation about a phenomenon, his or her cognitive categories have already taken shape within that particular society. I mean, look at, for example, during the early phase of AIDS epidemic, and how research, for example, in the field of acquired immune deficiency, because of the stigma that was attached to AIDS, how federal funding were very few and far in between because of the stigma that Christian right had attached to the phenomenon of AIDS. So my point is that because of the political dimensions of give and take and a contestation between Edward Said and Bernard Lewis, the question sort of was diverted from its epistemic and sociological domain, carried into a political domain, and thus modified in terms of what exactly is the supposition. The proposition is not that Orientalists were evil people. The proposition is that there is a relationship between a mode of knowledge that is produced under certain political circumstances and those political circumstances. The next move in the career of Edward Said is a book that he wrote, Culture of Imperialism, about a decade later, called Culture and Imperialism, in which he does two things. Number one, expands the domain of his observation, not limiting it to scholarship, but into literary domain, but also paying attention to cultures of resistance to imperialism. Okay, there is a two-way street, or as some observers have said, empire strikes back. In the field of literature, it is very important for us who now read Edward Said to remember that, contrary to assertions, Edward Said did not politicize. Of all people, Edward Said did not politicize literature. He posited a political interlocutor to the act of the literary. You can posit, for example, a feminist critique to an act of the literary. You can posit a political, you can posit an economic, class-based interpretation, but it doesn't rob, the whole idea of contrapuntal reading, which was Edward Said's sort of hermeneutic principle, is that unless you posit a contestant interlocutor to a literary text, it is mute. You have to make it speak in a language. And what interlocutor you posit, that text, otherwise mute, begins to speak that language. This, as a result, in an age that now goes for aesthetics, everything is beautiful. As a result, you go and watch Beethoven's Fidelio, and all you hear is how beautiful it was. No. Beethoven's Fidelio was staged at a time that Napoleon was in Brandenburg Gates. It has a profound political impact. Verdi's operas are definitive to Italian nationalism, correct? So once you say, okay, let's look at Verdi's opera through the lens of Italian Risorgimento, of nationalism, it doesn't rub. It doesn't mean that when you go and hear, I don't know, whatever is your favorite, Va Pensiero choral, that you enjoy it any less. No, in fact, you diversify the varieties of ways in which the opera can be enjoyed by historicizing it, by putting it in those contexts. Now, what remains also, I said something about how you need to historicize varieties of Orientalism as modes of knowledge production about the empire prior to the European 18th and 19th century European colonialism, as in the case of Aeschylus's Persian or in the case of Mozart's abduction from Seraglio. We need now to go forward to see what happened in sort of the American phase of Orientalism. Towards the end of his book, Orientalism, Edward Said talks about Orientalism revisited, Orientalism in modern age, and in which he talks about American Orientalism. Here again, pygmies that we are, we stand on the shoulder of a giant. We need to think sort of ahead of Edward Said and see what is it that he left untheorized. What I mean by that is Orientalism as a mode of knowledge production about the empire didn't stand still, because the empire doesn't stand still, because the culture of capital doesn't stand solid, because capital is moving, so is the culture that goes after it. As a result, in the contemporary sort of during the Cold War, what you no longer have the mode of knowledge production conducive to, say, British or French colonialism, but you have a mode of knowledge production which is conducive to the Cold War. That's the period that in American and European universities, you have the mutation of departments of Oriental Studies into Department of Area Studies. What are these areas? These are the areas of countries surrounding the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. So you have the departments of Near Eastern Studies, or departments of Eastern European Studies, or departments of Far Eastern Studies, areas that were sort of a belt around the Soviet Union, and these departments of area studies were meant to generate knowledge for the public use of how one were to deal with both the Soviet Union and the impact of Soviet Union. But with the end of Soviet Union and collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of this condition of a single superpower, that mode of knowledge production is no longer valid anymore either. Okay? There is a book by a fellow about ivory, what does he call it? Ivory towers built on sand, something like that.
Ivory towers on sand.
Ivory towers on sand, thanks. In which the author says that those of us who teach in departments of area studies, we did a terrible job. How come we didn't anticipate the events of 9/11? That's an extraordinary comment. Why? Because the assumption is that we were there. First of all, we're all terrorists. We know how the mind of a terrorist works. So as a result, we should have anticipated the events of 9/11, number one. Number two, that we are here to provide intelligence. How, in fact, is United States foreign policy to be operated? And the author of this book said this at a moment that, in fact, a generation of academic intellectuals, and I will say a footnote about academic intellectuals, emerged that, in fact, believed in providing contested knowledge, a knowledge that is, in fact, at the service of, as Edward Said put it, saying no to power, a knowledge that is at the service of the public, that ultimately produces institutions that is supposed to use that knowledge. Now, this particular episode is an episode in which the academic intellectual, which is a very peculiar phenomenon, is not the phenomenon of public intellectuals that we have had in Europe and United States prior to its demise. There are two fantastic studies by Jacobi, for example, the last intellectual, of how the phenomenon of suburbanization of intellectuals eliminated the social basis of the public intellectuals, instead immersed academic intellectuals. Academic intellectuals, this is the issue, have privatized mind. The mind is bought and paid for. An academic intellectual is told, what do you want? You want a salary? Here's your salary. You want an apartment in New York with half of the rent? Here's an apartment with half of the rent. Your retirement plan. Your children can go to school for free. Your medical. Everything is, what else do you want? In sub-freezing temperature, going to the streets of New York, screaming on top of your voice, long live this, down with that. It's an anathema. Doesn't make any sense, correct? You stay home, you write your pathetic articles, publish them in peer review articles in a pathetic language that nobody other than you and 2.5 people understand, and you're bought and paid. Privatized, institutionalized mind. Okay? So the thing that intellectual freedom is in jeopardy is a hogwash. Is really not. There is a book that is just out that identifies 101 most dangerous professors, one of which is standing in front of you, so watch it. There are 100, and in a country that we have tens of thousands of faculties, the most learned, the most intelligent, the most erudite, only 101? I mean, it's, that's so the point that I'm trying to make, that the institutionalized mind, the compromised mind, the privatized mind, is the phenomenon that we have in it, that when we face catastrophic phenomenon such as the blood of 655,000 human beings on our hand, we don't know what to do. Right now our discussion is, should we invade Iran or should we not invade Iran? And the question, would we please just pause for a minute to catch up to with the horror we just perpetrated in Iraq, and then after a while, okay, now we'll go for the next atrocity. It was a good thing that we have a Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam syndrome was good. We should have never recuperated from. No country on earth may ever be recuperated from syndromes of, that prevents it from military adventurism. And simply because there is no draft in this country, and only poor and disenfranchised people in poor and disenfranchised communities are grabbed by the throat of their poverty and shipped halfway around the globe to kill other people, it doesn't mean that the rest of us are exempted from moral, social responsibility. In this domain, what do we have? We have, this is the the most recent stage of the relationship between knowledge / culture and imperialism. We have the phenomenon of think tanks. This is the phenomenon that today we face. The phenomenon of think tank has to do with the recognition, and the best documentation of it is by Lewis Lapham, September 2004 issue of Harper's Magazine, has a fantastic article called Tentacles of Rage, in which he documents how from the civil rights movement forward, these think tanks and these corporations and all of these lucrative grants that they give to people, and then what Lewis Lapham does, he takes the most important and the most widely read books, such as Francis Fukuyama, such as Samuel Huntington, etc., who funded them, and the small number of foundations that have funded these books, and how popular they are, and how widely read they are, in a way that they establish the discourse. This is the phenomenon. They establish the language that we need to. Should U.S. invade Iran or not? If we say no, please, no invasion, so you are pro-Islamic Republic. No, I am not pro-Islamic Republic. For 25 goddamn years, I have been writing against the Islamic Republic. Okay? I can't set foot on the goddamn Islamic Republic without being sent to Evin prison. So no, I'm not for the Islamic Republic, but I'm not also for the war. So the two choices that you're giving me are not sufficient. And as a free person, as a citizen, as a human being, I'm allowed to imagine. I'm allowed to think. and to get together with my fellow citizens, my fellow taxpayers. Our tax money right now are building bombs and dropping them on other people, to think about alternatives that in fact sees the similarities between an Islamic republic, a Jewish state, and a Christian empire, and a Hindu fundamentalism. These are if we do that, that is, if we are allowed to think in identical terms, if you catch me dead to say something against Jewish state that I don't say exactly the identical thing about the Islamic Republic, and in fact I have said it about the Islamic Republic decades earlier, then you can accuse me of anything you wish. But if I argue for a cosmopolitan, pluralistic condition in which all citizens of a republic have a say in their collective fate, then you can't accuse me of being selective and forgetting this and having a double standard, right? It is this public domain that now is either at the mercy of sort of disregard, not mercy, disregard of privatized minds who are very happy in their university jobs and have nothing to say. In fact, the language with which to speak, just look at somebody eyeball to eyeball and in fact be at the mercy of making a fool out of yourself. Do you follow? We in the academy are used to when we say, oh, yes, sir, and then because if you don't record it properly at the end of the semester, you will be presumably punished. But here, right now, in this space, you are in a position, and I am at the mercy of one of you getting up and say, you are a fool and you are a moron, and just sort of walk out of me, right? That is the public equal terms in which we enter, offer our reading of a historical circumstances, solicit ideas, and then we walk out of here more than anything else reminded of the sociability of our very human species. Humans are these iPods, this thing I was talking to you today about this iPod. I mean, we all have become within our own cocoons. You can't have eye contact with a human being. Now, I'm not antiquarian. I'm not against iPod. I'm not against cell phones. It is the question of how use it intelligently to generate, sustain a more enduring humanity in which machines don't replace us, but we in fact use machines more creatively, effectively. So one side are these institutionalized minds in the academy, and second is a mode of knowledge production that is conducive and coterminous with think tanks. What are think tanks? Multi-billion-dollar endowments in which you produce a knowledge that is compatible with whatever policy you want. You want weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? I'll give you weapons of mass destruction. I'll give you charts and chapters and articles that have been written with footnotes that prove that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. What else do you want? Oh, you want some connection to Al-Qaeda? I'll give you a connection to Al-Qaeda. How many sources do you want? So it is, in fact, the policy that determines the knowledge that is produced. Do you follow? It is what we are now. Thus, my initial point of needing a condition in which we reconnect back to a civil rights movement in the 1960s, and rethink what it means to be politically committed and what does political commitment mean? Political commitment is not for political activists who do it 7 days. In fact, don't ever trust people who do political activism 7 days a week and have no other thing. Political activism has to be integral to ordinary human beings who have 9-to-5 jobs, have mouths to feed, have rents to pay, have bills to that they are the ones that have to be politically active. In that condition, what is our current situation? Our current situation is, I'm going to conclude with a quotation from Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, okay? Written by Alexis de Tocqueville. Is a French name. It's not Muhammad, Ahmad, it's not Hamid or Goldberg or anything. It's Alexis de Tocqueville. It's not the Quran or Hadith. It is Democracy in America. He wrote it in French, properly translated into very good English, and multiple English translations of it exist. So an excellent quote. The years are very, very important. Alexis de Tocqueville was sent on a commission in the year 1831, ladies and gentlemen. 1831. The man the word genius is abused these days, spent a bit more than a year in the United States, went back to France, and in 1835 published the first volume of Democracy in America, and in 1840 published the second volume of Democracy in America. And to this day, certainly through my graduate years as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, generations of American sociologists are baffled. How could this man have such insights? 1832. And as a sign of his genius, he also makes very silly mistakes about his observations. But the observations that are accurate are mind-boggling. I would like to conclude with one of his observations. This is about how, in the United States, dissent, voices of dissent, are not tolerated. Okay? This is what he says. Formerly, tyranny used the clumsy weapons of chains and hangmen. Nowadays, even despotism, though it seemed to have nothing more to learn, has been perfected by civilization. Princes made violence a physical thing, but our contemporary democratic republics have turned it into something as intellectual as the human will it is intended to constrain. Under the absolute government of a single man, despotism, to reach the soul clumsily struck at the body, and the soul, escaping from such blows, rose gloriously above it. But in democratic republics, that is not at all how tyranny behaves. It leaves the body alone and goes straight for the soul. The master no longer says, think like me or you die. He does say, you are free not to think as I do. You can keep your life and property and all. But from this day, you are a stranger among us if you don't think like we do. You can keep your privileges in the township, but they will be useless to you. For if you solicit your fellow citizens' votes, today we can add or sympathy or ideas or solidarity or would you please just listen to what I have to say, they will not give them to you. And if you only ask for their esteem, they will make excuses for refusing that. You will remain among men, forgive him his misogyny, or women. But you will lose your rights to count as one. When you approach your fellows, they will shun you as an impure being. And even those who believe in your innocence will abandon you too, lest they in turn be shunned. Go in peace. I have given you your life, but it is a life worse than death. What Tocqueville is arguing is the condition of the assumption of majority common wisdom. Fox News, CNN, New York Times. We get up in the morning, we watch them, we read them, we are given the basic vocabulary of what the majority thinks, right? I offered, early after September the 11th, the suggestion, the idea, that perhaps this thing that Pentagon keeps calling Al-Qaeda, that yes, perhaps there is in some cave, the proverbial cave in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden is presiding over a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda. However, that potential fact has a remote connection to what Pentagon is calling Al-Qaeda. That perhaps what Pentagon calls Al-Qaeda is the blueprint of how to remodulate American army in a way that can actually cope with the projected power that it keeps projecting. That the fact is that given the imperial intentions of the United States, this 1 million strong army cannot cope with it. So how about if we create a conception of military that operates like a guerrilla operation, like a terrorist organization, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and as a result we create fear in the heart of the world more than we are actually capable of such thing. The proof of that, I said, listen, 350,000 US Army is deployed in the Persian Gulf. The North Koreans are waving their nuclear warheads. You want it, we have it right here, but Americans can't. Unless they pull out of the Persian Gulf theater of operation and go redeploy there, they can't. Now, I'm not a military historian. I can't tell one weapon from another. It's a speculation, right? Is a one human being, one citizen, thinking imaginatively, creatively. I cannot prove it in a court of law. I was made a complete fool of, made look like a two-headed monster on the front pages of New York tabloids. That he thinks that Al-Qaeda doesn't exist. I mean, what is it that what I said suggests that Al-Qaeda doesn't exist? Do you follow? So the common knowledge, the common wisdom, the common form of understanding, the minute that you begin to divert from it a little bit, they do to you what Tocqueville says they do to you. The answer to it is again in Tocqueville. Tocqueville said, in American democracy what happens, individuals become equal, but equally weak in front of the totalitarian tendencies of the state. The genius of American democracy, Tocqueville discovered. He was trying to figure out what is happening in this country. The genius of American democracy, he said, is the creation of voluntary associations that act as bumper zones between atomized individuals. You follow? I'm now borrowing a term, atomized individual, which was actually a term that later on Sir Ralph Dahrendorf used about the Nazi Germany. Atomized individuals and the totalitarian tendencies of the state. Voluntary associations act as bumper zones that people come together and protect each other. You follow? This is neighbors for peace. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's a synagogue or a church or a mosque or a dance club or a university or any sort of voluntary association that we come together, and the creative and judicious use of cyberspace in order to make those voluntary associations more powerful, ladies and gentlemen, as the only solution between being atomized into senseless, mindless consumers of CNN and whatever nonsense they feed us. Okay, or complete apathy. Between apathy and false commitment and false belief, there remains this voluntary association, such as this middle of this storm, for you opting any number of options, the splendid options you could have had, including sitting home and watching some sitcom, to come here and simply think collectively. I have talked more than my share of this. I have been undemocratic. Forgive me, and thank you for your patience.
If you would, could you flesh out a little bit more what it might look like if in fact, the U.S. Takes any military action toward Iran, given its size, its power, its sense of identity going back many, many centuries. My sense of it is, without knowing much about it, that it would make Iraq look like a picnic.
The exact same words I used in a recent interview. God forbid, should the United States or Israel involved in any military operation in Iran, what will follow, not only in Iran, but in the region, in Iraq, in Palestine, in Lebanon, will make look, odd as it seems, what happened in Iraq like a Sunday picnic. Number one, we don't have military capacity to do this. But remember, we right now, you and I, are talking as ordinary human beings with common sense. Your reason and my reason, and we exchange opinions. I have absolutely no way of being convinced that people who are presiding over our destiny enjoy a common sense. I have no idea what Karl Rove right now is sitting and thinking, what surprise, what month over the next 2 years for them to continue to keep the White House. I'm moderately optimistic after this recent election. I have my reasons to be concerned that, in fact, this recent election might give the Karl Rove and the Republican Party an occasion, a circumstance in which they will think of coming with some crazy cockamamie idea. And certainly the Islamic Republic has tons of horrible facts about it that it gives anybody reason, excuse to attack it. But the consequence both for the Islamic Republic, particularly for the most disenfranchised, namely the women, however valiantly they are fighting for it, and for the region, and for the United States, I believe in a ricochet theory of violence. When you generate violence, violence will come back and hit you. It is not that you just unleash it in one way. It will come back to hit you. What way, in what psychological, psychopathological, social, political ways we are yet to see.
I was wondering at this point what your feeling would be to if the military was to remove itself from Iraq, what destabilization would occur in that part?
The question is that should the United States withdraw militarily from Iraq, what will be the consequences? This is a very legitimate question that, in fact, I have been asked since perhaps the first or second month after the US-led invasion. And my response has always been that, in fact, as a recent study, both by Americans and the British concluded, the presence of the US or US-led coalition in Iraq is more destabilizing than is stabilizing. This is something that many people like me have been saying. Now, practically, you can talk about, for example, a UN force, a la the model that, for example, is deployed in southern Lebanon. You can talk about Organization of Islamic States. You can talk about Arab League. You can talk about ad hoc force that is from the region, regional security force that can emerge. Once you come to the conclusion right now that the presence of American military and the British military in the region is in fact more the cause of the trouble rather than the cure. And right now, remember, the Americans in fact have pulled back, and the only thing that is safe are the pipelines that are perfectly flowing. And then if the Sunnis and Shias and God knows what are at each other's throat, nobody cares. So human casualty has increased because Americans have pulled back into their barracks and they want to have anything to do with anything. And whereas the economic consequence, namely the oil, is flowing uninterrupted, or mostly uninterrupted. So there are, I mean, your concern is perfectly legitimate. You go and create havoc in a region. How do you resolve it? But as a rule of thumb, my argument has always been that the absence of this occupying force and an end to this illegal and immoral war is a better. So once we come to that conclusion, then is what is the solution? The solution is any number of factors. I mean, I don't think that I have any definitive answer other than the ones that I suggested.
Specifically for you, Golbar, what observations might you have to make about the condition of the current dynamic between, for example, Iranian feminists like yourself and the level of consciousness and solidarity and support with organized women's groups in the state today? And have we made any progress at all in setting aside the kind of prejudice that's been so inculcated in this country to really develop a more advanced notion of supporting our sisters in other parts of the world?
What's the question?
Right. The question is if the American women's movement has been successful in sort of helping Iranian feminists, and if Iranian feminists have been working with them. Is that correct?
Well, and also, how much of an obstacle have preconceptions and misunderstandings of what Iranian women and women in the Middle East, women outside of America experience in a way that's not so sort of infantilizing?
Sure. I mean, I think that for me personally, works of black feminists in the United States have been very empowering, and I've studied them and I've used them. Unfortunately, Iranian feminists mostly come from the middle, sort of upper classes. So they identify very much with sort of white 1970s kind of feminism. So they have actually helped in creating this image of Muslims, women in the Middle East as being backward, and they've had a very Eurocentric sort of point of view that is, as soon as we have these secular sort of European-like states, everything is going to be fine. I would like to see Iranian feminists use more works of black post-colonial transnational feminism than they do now. I'm a newcomer to the United States. I've only been here for about a year, so I don't know much about how much women's groups in this country have been working with sort of NGOs in Iran and so forth. So I wouldn't know that. But there's a language barrier. Work produced here is in English, obviously. Women in Iran produce their work in Persian and such. But with cyberspace, there's been a lot of knowledge and a lot of work going on. So that has been very, very helpful. But more of a sort of a transnational feminist movement is what's needed.
You and your wife were in Lebanon before the war, and you had a very nice article that how the country would look like. After the war, what do you think that war had impacted whatever will happen in the Middle East and in Iran, or the impact of that on the insurgency in Iraq and the whole situation that the Sheikh Crescent, or so they are talking about it in the media?
As I said in that article, of course, I wrote that article and a very traumatized. We left Beirut 2nd of July, and within days, our friends, colleagues, comrades with whom we had been just a few days ago were under a bombardment. So it was, it was, as you know, a very traumatized piece that I had to write. But I think what the consequence of that senseless invasion, which if you are trying to live in a neighborhood, why would you go around and sort of start a war against somebody who is entirely senseless, is that suddenly Hezbollah emerged as an army of national resistance. There was not that much space in that article for me to say that I have committed anti-Islamist friends inside Lebanon who were, when we were having our discussions and conversations, etc., demanding and forcing Hezbollah to disarm. And there were, after the Taif agreement, there was no reason for Hezbollah to keep their weapons, etc. After the withdrawal of the Syrians, there was tremendous pressure, first of all, to disidentify Hezbollah with the Islamic Republic, and second, to disarm Hezbollah, and to incorporate Hezbollah into the political culture of Lebanon. The minute that the first bomb started, our most secular friends, most anti-Hezbollah friends, suddenly, even in my cautionary note that yes, Hezbollah is not putting the resistance, however, we have to be careful for this phenomenon not to turn into Islamic Republic of Lebanon, they didn't want to hear anything of that sort. They said, no, your anxiety is entirely misplaced, because of your concern about Islamic Republic. But my sense is that demographically, this is the thing that I was also conveying today, demographically in Iraq, Shi'i minority has to, not out of the goodness of Muqtada Sad's heart, they have to compromise with the Sunnis, with the Kurds, and also let's not just keep dividing Iraq into these Sunnis and Kurds, etc. There's a prolonged 200 years of a civil society, of a nationalist movement, particularly in Iraq. As a result, there is a possibility of a cosmopolitan political culture, pluralistic cosmopolitan political culture in Lebanon that can become, in fact, exemplary for the rest of the Arab world and replicated in Iraq. And then, instead of Islamic Republic of Iran cloning itself in Iraq and in Lebanon with two other horrid Islamic republics, that a political pluralism and cosmopolitanism, in fact, to import back to Iran what Iran had before at the wake of the Islamic so-called Islamic Revolution, this revolution was Islamicized under certain circumstances, beginning with the hostage crisis, during the Iran-Iraq war, and then with the Salman Rushdie affair. These three events are critical in systematically and brutally eradicating nationalist, socialist dimensions of the Iranian revolution, and as a result, the possibility of, instead of Islamic Republic exporting an Islamic Republic, the model that I'm sort of daydreaming here, with facts on the ground, not just hallucinatory, importing a pluralistic cosmopolitan political culture is evident. And my observation is that that is precisely the only model that can, in fact, survive, be the solution for the Palestinian-Israeli situation. The end of a Jewish state, emergence of a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, binational state, in which all Palestinians and all Israelis as citizens of a republic live. Not a single human being has to go anywhere. They all stay there. And as I repeatedly say, I don't even have anything against the settlers who from Brooklyn think that Palestine is promised to them by God and they have to go there. Jews have historical claim to Palestine. They are Palestinians and they have every reason to go and live in Palestine. But within, not a Jewish state. That's the difference. The Jews, of course, have a historical claim to Palestine, but not a Jewish state. The Muslims in Palestine cannot say, oh, Muslims are being persecuted in Hyderabad, so how about if we have an Islamic Republic in Palestine? Christians cannot say, oh, Christians are being persecuted in Darfur, how about if we have a Christian colony in here and bring all the Christians here? No. All the citizens of Israel-Palestine, and if you want to call it Israel, that's their business. Kalamazoo is their business. Palestine is their business. And they have, like all other nation states, they will have, what should we call it, immigration laws in which people can apply and go. There is plenty of room. I have traveled from one end of it to another end of it for all the Palestinian refugees to go back to their homeland, and even for Orthodox Jews who believe this is their God-given land, for them immigrate and live there happily. Now, if you come and say, no, I'm for a two-state solution, this is too idealistic, etc., we as ordinary people are entitled to dream the impossible. And until we put the one-state solution, not out of a, oh, this is silly hallucination and so forth. Yes, there are, of course, Amira Hass, distinguished colleague and comrade, Israeli, says, you're daydreaming. What are you talking about? If you want to, I also am for a socialist state from this end of the world to that end of the world. But this doesn't work. And she's right. There are Palestinians who don't want to have anything to do with Israelis, and Israelis who don't want to have anything to do with Palestinians. But we, who are neither Israelis or Palestinians, or thinking outside those two pigeonhole boxes, must be allowed to think the possibility. So, should this happen, the pluralistic proposition that I'm sort of detecting in Lebanon, replicated in Iraq, potentially in Iran, and the rest of the Arab world, all of these useless potentates from Syria to Morocco, can be in fact replicated in Israel-Palestine itself.
Dave, and then I'll take you next.
I've been always wondering why, in terms of the nuclear powers, there's only one nuclear power that is a religious state, Israel. And I'm curious, is that going to influence the ability to change or to bring about what we're hoping in your mind? And why is Pakistan so different than Iran in terms of, oh, we can't let them have a nuclear bomb? Because they're so close and there's so many commonalities. I don't understand.
I mean, your answer is embedded in your own question. There is nothing that I really need to do. The only difference between the Pakistanis and Iranians, Pakistanis are the subcontractors of Americans. You want Taliban? Okay, we create it. How much will it cost? Oh, you don't want to dismantle? We'll dismantle it. How much are you going to pay for us? It's a subcontractor for Pentagon. The NGO, the National Growth of Pakistan is a subcontract for United States. That's the only thing that they do. The GNP. And in the case of Israel, is the same thing. By the way, Israel is not the only religious state with nuclear power. It's second. Can you get a thank you very much.
Christian state.
Okay.
Howard Zinn was just here a few weeks ago, and he said,
All the power to him.
we're an occupied country.
I take him, and then I'll come over to this side.
I guess my question is, one of the last comments you made, you mentioned Israel, that there are some Israelis who don't want to have anything to do with Palestinians and vice versa. But I guess, in a way, I want to play the devil's advocate by saying there are some Israelis who do want to have something to do with Palestinians and vice versa, and not just limited to those two nations, but to many other nations whose superstructures, right, or administrations are in conflict. And the majority of the time you find those who are willing to reconcile their cultural backgrounds, you find them in the iPod or more even contemporarily in the MySpace generation, right? So you have this sub-superstructure, and I call it super because it's a really influential structure in what's going on right now. Because of the use of technology and because of how pervasive technology is, you can't ignore the things that are happening in MySpace. You can't belittle it. So how do we deal with the problem that, I don't know if some of you guys are familiar with the work of Friedman and The World is Flat. He talks about the problem of imperialism no longer being an issue of powerful administrations or governments, but the problem of powerful corporations. Right? So how do we deal with the issue that these tools that are enabling people from different cultural backgrounds to communicate or to reconcile their differences, right, via alternative media, right, that they rely heavily on the very products, okay, that help drive a capitalistic and thus imperialistic society?
I think in formulating your excellent point, you really didn't need Tom Friedman to make your point. The world is not flat. But your essential question is absolutely correct. Is the phenomenon of pharmakon? Okay, that is, the cure comes from the poison. Do you follow? That is, that's why I repeatedly say the critique of technological modernity should not go overboard, so we become antiquarian and throw our iPods. I don't use it, but I have an iPod. Out of the window. That is precisely the same process of globalization and technological modernity that has become the carrying force of the operation of capital, can in fact bring people closer together, particularly in the case of Palestinian Israelis that you were saying. The best example that I can offer you is in fact in the case of both Palestinian and Israeli cinema. That happens to be one of my interests. Do you follow? It is impossible to find a Palestinian film that you don't have an Israeli producer or Israeli actor or Israeli, the set decorator. And it is impossible to find an Israeli film that you don't have a Palestinian director or a Palestinian actor or a Palestinian one thing or another. That is already in their extraordinarily wonderful cinema, both Israeli cinema and Palestinian cinema. The image, the ideal, the aspiration that I'm proposing here has already been achieved, okay, as one combination of technology. Perhaps the best example I can give you is a documentary made by a Palestinian Israeli filmmaker, Michel Khalaifi is a Palestinian, Eyal Sivan, Israeli, called Road 181. The two of them get together and go and remap the historical Palestine and go through a whole series of fantastic documentaries. The documentaries are available, and it would be wonderful for you guys to get to read them. So already in that particular technological artistic manifestation, you see how the two can come together and find a way out of the cul-de-sac.
Question about the question of whether Al-Qaeda exists or not. How would you respond to
veteran of Al-Qaeda who actually fought in Afghanistan, who actually, after the Soviet withdrawal, they put their arms down and they went back home. And they make the point that Osama bin Laden, in his many fraudulent ways, has appropriated the name Al-Qaeda for himself and his own cause, and he has murdered many of them with disagreement with the post-Soviet strategy of what the organization wants to do, just as he has done the same thing with the concept of religion.
I completely agree. The question is, in the sort of a speculative thinking that I did about Al-Qaeda as a blueprint of remodulating the U.S. Army, how would I respond to cases that actual members of the Al-Qaeda coming and saying that they were members of Al-Qaeda, and in fact, Osama bin Laden appropriated the term Al-Qaeda with the same brutality that he has appropriated the term Islam? I think I rephrase your question properly. My answer is that nothing that I have said in terms of what Al-Qaeda can mean here and how it can be abused disallows the sorts of factual evidence that you just put forward. The term Al-Qaeda becomes a multi-significatory signifier. It means any number of things in different contexts. But following your lead, one has to go back from Al-Qaeda to Taliban, from Taliban to Mujahideen, and follow the mutation of these terms. You follow? From the time that they were referred to by President Reagan as the functional, quote, functional equivalent of our founding fathers, end of quote, to the time that they became enemy number one. Okay? In the entirety of the 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and by the way, people who can pronounce Zbigniew Brzezinski, they can pronounce just about any other name. The only person who issued a jihad, the proclamation of a jihad, after Jack Reed, early in the 20th century, was Zbigniew Brzezinski, both of them in Central Asia, by the way. That's the history, that your genealogy of the vocabulary, right? That genealogy of the vocabulary entails, okay, let's go from who uses what term for what particular purposes. But in terms of bin Laden, let me just add one more point. I know Bruce Lawrence has collected his articles, his pronouncements, and translated them and published them. I have an entirely different reading of the creature. I don't think that what the gibberish that he says has absolutely anything to do with 200 years of Islamic ideology, of Islamic militant participation in social change, that the videos that he sends to Al Jazeera, to me, these are video installations. These are very carefully choreographed video installations, is an art form, in which he performs certain things, and from which I conclude that the sort of violence, you know, from Georges Sorel through Fanon, through Sartre, we have been, and Marx certainly theorizing violence, okay? Every state is founded on violence. This is not Muhammad Atta. This is Max Weber in 1919, right? But the kinds of violence that we see attributed to this thing, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Allah September the 11th, these are violences not directed for social change, but for spectacular purposes, for visual spectacular purposes. There is no social program, there is no political agenda, there is no revolutionary project behind these sorts of... Pardon me? It is totally nihilistic and totally, as I said, visual, for spectacular purposes. Okay, as soon as we hear 9/11, we remember the crumbling of the World Trade Center. So this by way of saying that there is a fantastic BBC documentary, The Power of Nightmares, that for all my admiration for it, it has a flaw when it puts Leo Strauss and Sayyid Qutb together, sort of dehistoricizes the genealogy from which Leo Strauss comes and the genealogy from which Sayyid Qutb comes. And for us, it's very important to rehistoricize them in order to be able to read the phenomenon of Osama bin Laden more properly.
Oh, well, you've been asked to hold in your hand. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. If I can have basically two parts. The first part is really a comment that you don't need to respond to at all. And the second one is my question. My comment is that I've heard tonight and the number of forces or weapons of the United States from the Christian state. And it receives some laughter. Now that may appeal to a mythos, and maybe that's why the laughter, but I would say that's really unfair and delusional. But that would require a lecture on my part, why the United States is hardly a Christian state. My question is, if both of you can explain and elaborate on how the 1979 revolution in Iran was Islamicized, which began apparently as use the word socialist or nationalist revolution, but somehow was taken over by, apparently, if I read you correctly, a minority group, Islamic forces.
Okay. I will answer your question. The reason why the Islamic Revolution was hijacked by one faction, they weren't a minority, they were one of the best organized, was that the actual leadership was in the hands of the Islamists, Ayatollah Khomeini. And so basically they had more power, they had more programs, they were more organized. So in that sense, and they used violence in suppressing all other factions, where the other factions, the nationalists, the socialists, didn't really have a program, and they were less well organized, basically.
I'll make a comment on your comment that you take objection to the United States being a Christian empire. I insist that the United States is a Christian empire, and I refer you first to the extraordinary work of the American sociologist Robert Bellah in the formation of what he calls civil religion, the particulars of which come from what is called Judeo-Christian tenets. Number two, to the absolutely astounding recent book of Kevin Phillips, American Theocracy, that chapter and verse, state by state, he documents this observation. So I hope that at least so far as we are concerned, when we make a comment, it is not to generate laughter. I fear, sir, I tremble. I escaped an Islamic republic, and I didn't want to end up in a Christian empire, and I have. That's so far as your comment is concerned. This, however, doesn't mean that I don't have a freedom to come here and say what I just said here, and that's why I struggle to sustain it. And I cannot say what I just said here in an Islamic republic. I'm not delusional. I'm very realistic, okay? And in order to safeguard what I have here, I have no other choice but practicing it to make sure that I have it. And the minute that I'm arrested, stripped of my citizenship rights, which is now stipulated, as my legal colleagues tell me, and sent to Guantanamo Bay, I'll practice it. And then if there somebody says that flushing of the Quran in Guantanamo Bay in the toilet is not something that is indicative of a Christian empire, or forcing Iraqi inmates in Abu Ghraib eat shit while cursing the Quran is not an indication of a Christian empire, then I'll change my mind. As to how Iranian revolution was Islamicized, I can plug my book. I have a book coming out, Iran, A People Interrupted, in which, it's coming out in March, in which I gave very detailed history, but it is not it's one of his jumbo books. It's in fact quite short. And I have written it for a mass audience that I hope to reach. But very shortly, not to leave your question unanswered, you can begin, for example, with the coup of 1953. Usually 1950s is the height of Iranian nationalism, identified with Prime Minister Mossadegh, and the height of Iranian nationalism. And Iranian nationalism has a history that goes back all the early 19th century, formation of the idea of the nation-state. And particularly after the coup engineered by the British and the Americans, mother of the parliament and children of Thomas Jefferson conspired to deny a people possibility of a democracy, Iranian nationalism has in fact become more and more intensified. So far as socialist dimensions of the revolution, the origin of Iranian socialism goes before, in fact, the Soviet Russian Revolution of 1917, and the culmination of it becomes in the most progressive political organization of 20th century in Iran, the Tudeh party, however discredited they become in the aftermath of the 1953 coup. And after the demise of the Tudeh party, of course, the heroic efforts of the Cherikai Fadai Khalq, the Fadai Khalq organization, however factionalized they later became, but the Siyahkal today with dear friend and colleague, Ms. Farideh Harandi, we were talking, and here, right between her and me, we identify ourselves as children of Siyahkal. Siyahkal was is a socialist, revolutionary guerrilla movement in northern Iran by a band of heroic guerrillas, socialist revolutionary Marxists, that they were integral to the cause and course of the revolution. Up until the moment that the revolution was successful, they were definitive to the formation of the revolution, definitive to its every aspect of the success and the toppling of the Pahlavi regime. But as Golberg said, the Islamist groups, which themselves were multifaceted, were not just one Islamist group, were more organized, more connected, and the nationalist and socialist factions were more fragmented. I mean, it's not something for me to abuse your time now here. And as a result, under the smoke screen of the hostage crisis of 1979-1980, while the world's attention were diverted to 52 American hostages, the leftist organizations were brutally eliminated, attacked, and destroyed. And then subsequently, during the Iran-Iraq War, particularly in 1986, massive numbers of Iranian lefts were murdered by Islamic Republic in prisons. So, and then by also appropriating the nationalist and socialist language and lingo into the Islamist vocabulary. So, yes, this was a multifaceted, pluralistic, and cosmopolitan political culture that gave rise to this sort of a revolution. But for reasons that are evident and historians all know it, it was hijacked and it was stolen and it was Islamicized, but always with heroic resistances by Iranians themselves to claim back their multifaceted and pluralistic political culture.
I belong to a group called Not In My Name, the Chicago chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. We go out every Sunday for an hour in Water Tower Park from 12 to 1. And we hand out literature, and 19 out of 20, I stand there saying, read about peace in the Middle East, and 19 out of 20 people walk by. They don't want to read about peace in the Middle East. They don't want to hear anything about it. They don't want to think about it. Along those lines, I want to mention that this particular Sunday, we're having our usual vigil, but we're having a special vigil against the massacre in Gaza. If anybody wants to join us, please do. Noon. Water Tower Park, 830 North Michigan.
Chicago and Michigan.
Chicago and Michigan. Okay. My question is, what do you think it takes to break the monopoly on opinion? I mean, I would guess that in the case of Iraq, part of the point is, there were these soldiers who came from all over the country and were injured, came back crazy, came back missing limbs, and a lot of people who would have never thought about it, were forced to think about it. So that's part of it, I'm sure. There were also investigative journalists who, there's been, a real industry of investigative journalism, and maybe that's part of it too. But what do you think it would take in the case of, I guess, in the case of Iran and also in the case of Israeli-Palestinian conflict to just break that hold?
I think, as Hamid has been saying, community-based activism and the use of cyberspace. I think during Vietnam we didn't have internet, we didn't have all this alternative media, and we do now. And I think news is traveling very fast. I myself read lots of news from different sites, alternative, and obviously people getting together, getting news from all sorts of places is what's going to help. That's what I think.
Well, that's number one. Number two, I think that there is people like you and me, that is this source of activism. The burden of responsibility is ultimately on us. The reason being that the term of the engagement needs to be changed from either or to a third possibility. Take, for example, the question of Holocaust. There is absolutely no question, as Norman Finkelstein has ably demonstrated, that the legitimate horrors that post-Holocaust Jews around the world have been abused by Zionism in order to legitimize the atrocities of the Israeli state. But I believe, no matter what you do to the atrocities of Holocaust, how you abuse it, still the enormity and singularity of that terror is such that words should never be left off the hook from it. But instead of using it in order to sustain the current status quo, you have to reverse it. First of all, Holocaust is not the only European atrocity against European Jewry. You go back to pogroms and you connect the history that culminates in the European Holocaust, and in fact now has mutated. The same anti-Semitism in Europe mutated into shifting the target from the Jew into the Arab. It's the same thing. I mean, the cartoon very clearly indicated that the same physiognomy that historically has been used for mimicking and ridiculing the Jew now is the Arab nose and distorted face, etc. What I believe has happened is exactly the opposite of the conspiratorial theory that the Jewish community controls American foreign policy. I think exactly the opposite. I disagree with Walton Mersheimer, the lobby, blaming everything on the bottom. Yes, AIPAC is exceedingly powerful, but so are the Cubans. You cannot blame this criminal atrocities that the Americans do around the world only on the AIPAC. This doesn't work. It is the opposite, namely the abusing of the post-Holocaust anxiety of the American Jews, which is perfectly legitimate, for illegitimate American foreign policy. You follow? It's exactly the opposite. So it is in a way not simply to deconstruct the abuse of Holocaust, but reclaim Holocaust as a moral a point in Jewish history that will rethink Israel. Zionism was a mistake, was a terrible mistake. If I were around at the time of Herzl, and Herzl came and said, Jews are being persecuted in Eastern Europe, we need to do something about it. Yes, of course, I'm behind it. Let's go do something. But where? Let's build a state for all the Jews. Well, I'm opposed to singular religious state, Islamic, Jewish, etc. I get nervous. It just doesn't quite work. But even so, okay, let's have a Jewish state. But where? Where exactly do you want to do it? On the broken back of Palestinians? Let's assume that Israel is God's gift to democracy. Let's forget that 4 different laws in Israel are used to disappropriate Palestinians of their properties. The Jordanian law, the British Mandate law, the Ottoman law, and the Israeli law. Okay? Let's forget that. Let's assume Israel is a democratic state. But where is it built? On what broken back? The Palestinian Nakba is the Israeli Nakba, is the Jewish Nakba. The Jewish consciousness cannot live, this is my proposition, with the Palestinian Nakba. It's simply shifting it. So, what breaks it is the break that as soon as you utter a word against Israel, you are anti-Semite. As I always say, only anti-Semites are afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism. If you're not afraid. You just say whatever you want to say. And put it to the test of the rest of the world until there is a hidden anti-Semitism that you don't want to touch anything that is critical of Israel. Your names, your reputation, your credentials, you're made to look like a 2-headed monster in New York if you say anything against Israel. Your words are distorted. Your lifetime achievement as a decent human being, as a scholar, as a professional, is at jeopardy if you say it. So people shun away. Why should I bother? Do you follow? So those who have the moral courage to stand in front of this storm and say this, what not a single human being in Israel needs to go anywhere. This notion of go back to where you came from is absolute nonsense. There is plenty of room for everybody to live happily. Then we have additional problems of gender issues, class issues, etc., which are additional. But not a single human being needs to go anywhere. And if they want to call it Timbuktu, that's their business. So the burden is on those who dare to imagine the otherwise, and not this Bantustan. I mean, I'm sure you have been to Palestine, Israel. Kalkilia is being choked like this. Oh no, they can have their estate. Estate where exactly? From Nazareth to Jerusalem, there's a highway, right? That I have traveled through it. And on that highway, on every hill, beautiful hills that you have, there is a settlement. This is between Nazareth and Jerusalem. And the beautifully constructed highway by the Israeli army, all the exits go into these hilltops, onto these settlements. When the hills come together, there are these beautiful Palestinian villages. Some of them have a minaret of a mosque, some of them are a steeple of a church. Not a single road from this highway goes into any one of these. As Amira Hass's article said, they don't exist. It's invisible. Even the dirt roads that existed between these villages have been bulldozed and don't exist. So if you are a Palestinian farmer and you have your lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers and want to sell them, you have to get on your mule and go from village to village until such time that you have access to this highway to sell your vegetables to earn a living.
What do you think about this phenomenon about Islamic fundamentalists?
That is the last question.
And also, how do you describe them? How do you describe Islamic fundamentalism?
I see. I think that the very term Islamic fundamentalism, if we were to, is an English term and is an adaptation of Christian fundamentalism. Even in Arabic, in Persian, in Urdu, you have neologisms. In Persian, we call it usul-gara, which is a neologism, meaning a word didn't exist in Persian. You have fundamentalism, then you go and, or in Arabic, usuliya is the same thing. You take it and you go back and invent it. No, it doesn't mean that the phenomenon didn't exist. At some point, I do agree with you that the confrontation between societies such as Iran or Egypt or Syria and what you call modernity, I call colonial modernity. That is, modernity went to these societies through the gun barrel of colonialism. Between the encounter, out of the encounter between colonial modernity and these societies, a variety of ideologies of resistance against colonialism emerged. Some of them were nationalist ideologies, some of them were socialist ideologies, and some of them were nativist ideologies. The phenomenon that you call Islamic fundamentalism, because also everybody else calls it Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism, is identical, for example, with liberation theology in Latin America. You follow? Liberation theology in the context of Latin America is the Christianity of the poor people, the Christianity that the current Pope, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, was chiefly responsible for opposing when he was in charge of the Vatican office in charge of doctrine. So you put it in a global context before you identify it one way or another. Once you do that, even within the context of Islamic societies, using Islam as a mode of ideological banner for political mobilization has a history. There is a historical difference between, say, as examples, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in South Asia, and Muhammad Abdo and Rashid Reza in North Africa and sort of Levant period, region, and say between Mutahhari and Shariati, and between what you now witness in Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden. Lumping everything together and calling it Islamic fundamentalism, this is the problem. Do you follow? You need to historicize. You have to need, at some point, Islamism was part and parcel of national liberation movements. Perfectly legitimate. They had a social... When you read somebody like Muhammad Abdu or Jamaluddin al-Afghani or Mutahhari or Talaqani, they were Islamist. They believe Islam has answer to everything. But they had a social program. They had a political agenda. They had a cultural idea of what the economic project. But not this horrid development called Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, etc. You need to historicize them. You need to go back to original sources in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Turkish, etc. And then once you crack them, and once you put them next to phenomena such as Pan-African movement, such as liberation theology, you see that another picture emerges, partially accounting for how Islamism has emerged over the last 200 years, and partially putting you in a position to say this form of nativist, they're mostly nativist resistances, has this particular historical topography, whereas the other one has a different historical topography. And also, in response to what is that being generated when the Islamism or Islamic fundamentalism, if we were to use your language, that was generated and institutionalized in confrontation with European colonialism was a different sort of Islamic fundamentalism than the one that we witness today on the site of Afghanistan, on the site of Iraq, and potentially on the site of Palestine. I hope, in part, I begin to open the question at least for you.
That was a good question because it helps us understand that the language hobbles us, especially the way it's used in order to pursue an agenda that is not humanitarian, but driven by often capital political interests. I want to thank Golbar Bashi and Dr. Dabashi for giving so generously of their time to us and for, I really think, helping us understand the intellectual poverty of society. So thank you for coming out from Neighbors for Peace, and
there's literature on the table outside as you go out.
We try to update our website with upcoming events. Thanks for...
Oh, thanks for having us. Thank you very much.
زمان عشق دیدی که چون سر آمد